I appreciate so much the invitation of the church here, and I'm really looking forward to this time together, not just because it'll be great to be associated again with the Mitchells, whom we've known for some time, and to learn from Andy. He's a hard-working fella, and I always learn something when I'm with him, but also to get to know you and this work. Heard good things about you. I think you have obviously great potential here, and I would do not one thing to hurt you or retard you. I hope that I can be of some help to you in your effort to constantly grow. Our subject, as has been announced this week, deals with the family. I think that's a good topic, an important topic. And we want to start out this morning by thinking about two Bible families. There are a lot of Bible examples of families. The two that I've chosen interest me. They have one thing in common. These two families do. They, I think, both come from a dynamic that is less than perfect, less than ideal. You know, we want to have our families to have every advantage, and I think that's important. But the truth is, there are times when we find problems in families, and we don't have a father and a mother and everybody pulling in the same direction and doing what they ought to do. I stress strongly, and we'll maybe mention this before the week's over, for our young people to be on fire for God, and then when you're looking for a marriage partner, find somebody who's on fire for God. I think that will really help you go to heaven, and it'll help you to be a blessing. But people sometimes find themselves in circumstances, however they may have gotten there, through their ignorance or through just poor choices or whatever it was. And so here we are now. What do we do now? And so I think in both these cases you have less than ideal circumstances, but the results are so different. One, I think, turns out to be a great success as a family, the other disaster. So let's think about these two examples. I want to start out by thinking with you about, I don't know how to work this. There we go. A man named Lot, character from the Old Testament that I'm sure you're familiar with. I don't want to start with the Old Testament. I want to go instead to 2 Peter chapter 2. Because when we talk about Lot, there are times when people, when they teach on Lot, I believe, do him an injustice. They would speak of Lot as if he were not much better than the folks in Sodom. This is, I believe, a mistake. I believe it's untrue. Lot, you remember, was the nephew of Abraham, and Lot's father died when he was fairly young, I suppose, and he became associated with Abraham's family. But 2 Peter 2 gives me a great insight into the character of Lot. And the context, you remember here, Peter is making the point that no matter what circumstances you might find yourself in life, you have to understand that God sees where you are, and God will always be there for His people. He knows how to distinguish between the unjust and the just. He knows how to deliver the just and to punish the unjust. And He uses the example of the angels, and He used the example of Noah's day, and He used the example of Sodom. And so just reading here in verse 6, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them with an overthrow, making them an example unto those that should live after should live ungodly. And delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among them and seeing and hearing vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds. The Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptation and reserve the unjust on the day of judgment to be punished. And we have this picture, this inspired opinion, if you will, or record of Lot's character. He is described as just Lot in the Old King James. That doesn't mean Lot alone. The word here is a word which means just as in a man of justice, a man of righteousness. In fact, the word just and the word righteous in verse 8 two times are the same word. Dikaios is a word from the word dike. It means just. He's a righteous man. He's a man who cares about justice. And it says about him that he was vexed. In the Old King James, you have the word vexed 2 times, but it's a different word. In one case, it's a word, the first time it's used there in verse 7. It's a word which suggests the idea of someone who is just exhausted by a burden. And the second time, the word suggests the idea of somebody being tortured. Same word used over in Revelation 20 to talk about the lake of fire. It's a strong word, to say the least. So here's the picture. Here is Lot. And Lot is a just man, a righteous man, a man who cares about right. He is a man who, when he sees the wickedness and ungodliness around him, is vexed. He is burdened, like a man trying to carry around a 100-pound weight. He is tortured by it. Can you relate to that at all, by the way? I'd be shocked if you can't in the world in which we live. Either that or you're pretty isolated from what's going on around you. I tell you what they do to you. We don't get to visit hospitals anymore. But we used to visit hospitals. That's probably my major exposure to daytime television. You'd be sitting in a waiting room, and they would torture you by putting on the television and letting divorce court or some other abomination come along there, in which people treat serious things like it was a joke, or some talk show by some person who had not a clue about the will of God, just babbling out all kinds of ungodly opinions and advice. And it would make your skin crawl. And you think, how do people stand this? And I can see Lot in the situation he was in toward the end of his life, being vexed and burdened by the things. Maybe we can relate to that. Sometimes people say, well, that was Lot before he got into the situation he was in. But, actually Lot later on was an unrighteous man. I don't think this passage will allow that. I don't believe that's so. I believe Lot was a righteous man. He was a righteous man when God delivered him from Sodom. But his story is not a pleasant story to tell, is it? Because it's not a happy story. And I think that's what makes it so powerful. When I read the story of Lot, I'm reading about the disaster that comes on a righteous man. Let me go back and just notice, when we talk about the story of Lot, we divide it sometimes into 3 parts. I do the story of Lot the blessed. In Genesis 13, we find he is associated with Abraham, and that's a blessing in and of itself, isn't it? Here's Abraham, the friend of God. He's blessed by that knowledge of Jehovah, by that access to God in a world that was, by and large, it seems, filled with idolatry. Even many of Abraham's family were given to idolatry, but Lot was on the right side of that. And they go down to Egypt and they come back, and when they come back, the text says that they were fabulously wealthy. Abraham was blessed, very rich, verse 2 says, in cattle and silver and gold. And verse 5 says, Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. And that's, you remember, where the problems began. The land was not able to bear them. They were so great. And there were many in the land, that were not necessarily friendly, all kinds of dangers. And so Abram, wise Abraham, said to Lot, we don't need to be on top of each other here, and the strife that's already begun get worse. So he said, I pray that there be no strife between me and thee, and my herdsman and thy herdsman. We're brethren. Verse 9, is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. And if thou wilt take the left hand, I will go to the right. If thou wilt depart to the right hand, I will go to the left. So after years of being truly blessed, now comes this moment in which a blindness, a focus on the wrong thing, and a blindness to other things takes place, or shows itself at least. Lot, in verse 10, lifts up his eyes, and he beholds all the plain of the Jordan that was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden. Hard to imagine. How beautiful it is when you see pictures of that region now. How beautiful it was. Lot chose the plain of the Jordan, and he journeyed east, and they separated themselves. The only thing that's said about that place that was appealing was it was good for business. It was well watered. It had the advantage there for a man whose business was in livestock. And Abraham then chose another path. He went to Canaan. Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent toward Sodom. But in verse 13, we all remember the statement there, that the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. I don't know how much Lot knew about the morals of the city that he was going toward. If he didn't know about them when he went, it wouldn't have taken him long to have figured it out. But he doesn't leave. He doesn't leave. Now, I know he didn't stay because he loved what was going on there. You know, Peter told us he hated what was going on, but he stayed. And in part it might have been because it was such a good place for business, and business was going maybe so well. But it seemed like after a number of things, we won't go into the whole story of Lot. You're familiar with that story, I trust. But, you know, a few years later, when Chedorlaomer and this band of Mesopotamian chieftains that had been overlords of that region came and in response to their failure to pay the tribute, you remember how that they were just swamped. They were absolutely overcome. They were taken prisoner. And here's Lot and his family marching toward Mesopotamia when he's rescued by Abraham. And he's allowed to go back, and he does go back. And he remains there. And maybe 20 years pass. And God comes to visit Abraham. And one of the things that comes out of that meeting in Genesis 18, you remember, is that the Lord has a message for Abraham, but he also has his angels heading toward Sodom. He's going to go down, this is Genesis 18 and verse 21, and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is come unto me, and if not, I will know it. That's obviously accommodative language. God knows what's going on. But it's rather a matter of giving them one more chance, it seems to me. And so two men will wind up going to Sodom. Abraham, who was spiritually aware of what was going on, a wise man, pleads, you remember, for Sodom in this famous encounter here at the last part of chapter 18. Wilt thou destroy, verse 23, the righteous with the wicked? I mean, maybe if there are 50 righteous within the city, wilt thou also destroy and not spare the place for 50 righteous that are therein? And far be it from thee to do after this manner, to slay the righteous with the wicked, that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Abraham's pleading here, and the Lord's responsive. And he says, if I find 50 righteous, I'll spare the city. How about 45? How about 40? How about 30? How about 20? I'll speak one more, for 10. If there be 10 righteous, I'll spare it for 10. So the angels go down to Sodom. And chapter 19 picks up the story, and we reacquaint ourselves here with Lot, who's sitting at the gate. He's in Sodom now. If he was pitched toward it, he's in it now. And here he is at the gate of Sodom, whatever he was doing. I suspect maybe what he was doing. He doesn't seem to be a judge in the city. That's where the judges sat. But it seems that what he was doing maybe was looking for unsuspecting people and trying to warn them, trying to help them. He vexed his righteous soul from day to day with what was going on there. And so he saw these two men. I don't think he had any idea who they were. I don't get any indication he did. But he wanted to bring them into his house. They said, no, we're going to just sleep in the street right here. I don't think they were being difficult, but they didn't come there to enjoy hospitality. They came there to put people to a test. But finally they are persuaded. They do go. They choose to go with Lot. And then in verse 4, you remember, before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the city about. old and young, all the people from every quarter. And they called unto Lot, and they said to him, Where are the men that came to thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them. And Lot went out to the door, shut the door after him, and he said, Brethren, I pray that you do not so wickedly. And then he did something that's just impossible to justify. This is where Lot offers to send out his daughters. There's no way to justify that. This is my think so. You don't have to believe this part. But Lot being a righteous man, if the Holy Spirit's right, he certainly is always right. I don't think for a moment that Lot would ever have actually done that. He knew that's not what these folks wanted. Although I remember the story in Judges. I remember the Levite and the concubine. My suspicion is that Lot was just saying what he thought he could to try to pacify these folks, to diffuse the situation. That doesn't justify the offer, but that's what I think he was thinking. But they weren't hearing it, and it didn't pacify them. They said, Stand back. And they said again, Oh, this fella, he's come to sojourn, and he wants to be our judge. We'll deal worse with you than with them. And it was, it seems, through the providence of God and the help of the angels, these men put their hand forth and pull Lot into the house and strike this mob with blindness. The word there, blindness, I don't think carries with it the idea of the inability to see. I think it maybe is more a state of confusion. It's used that way at least over in 2 Kings, when we find that same word used when the crowd was struck blind, you know, the Syrian soldiers. Anyway, so it was that the time has come. The decision's been made. The city is irredeemable. They will be destroyed. So we have the angels speaking now to Lot. And through God's providence and His grace, He's going to allow Lot to escape and his family. And so the men said to Lot, verse 12, Hast thou any here besides son-in-law, thy sons, thy daughters, and whatsoever thou hast in the city, bring them out of this place. The language of the Old King James reads a little bit differently than some. And the idea seems to be left here that Lot may have had a larger family. Some think that Lot had 2 unmarried daughters, 2 sons-in-law that were betrothed to them, and that was the extent of his family. This leaves the door open. Perhaps there were others there. I'm not sure 100% about that. But the point is, it's time to gather up whoever will, because you've got to go now. So we do know in verse 14 that Lot went out and spake to his sons-in-law, which were married to, or maybe betrothed to, his daughters. And he said, Up, get you out of this place, for God will destroy this city. But he seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. Or as one translation says, he seemed to be one jesting. They thought he was out of his mind. You got to be kidding. While he lingered, verse 16 says, the angel just took hold of him and his wife and the daughters that were there. And they gave them instruction. You got to leave now. Escape for thy life. Do not look behind thee. Neither stay thou in all the plain. Escape to the mountain. And Lot, you remember, argues about that, or at least makes the request, don't send me to the mountain. I can't survive up there. I'm not a mountain man. I suppose what he was thinking. There's a little city, Zoar. Let me go over there. And so the Lord gives him that. Grant, yes, you go there. But go. And when he goes, the fire and the brimstone rains upon the city. And verse 26 tells us that when God overthrew the cities of the plain, that his wife looked back from behind him, and that she became a pillar of salt. You know, when I was first reading the Bible, I used to read that and picture in my mind sort of the idea almost of someone jumping in some sort of involuntary thing. You know, if somebody comes up behind you and claps their hands loudly or drops a book behind you, you're going to jump and look. I don't think that's what went on here. I don't think that's what I'm not saying that wouldn't have been enough to violate the will of God, But I think the way Jesus used this expression, you remember in Luke 17, the Lord refers to this story, and it's the only other reference that I know of to Lot's wife in the Bible. And it's in Luke 17, and the context here, just to state it briefly, I believe to be the destruction of Jerusalem. God was going to would reach a point where he'd be so fed up with the rebellion of the Jewish state that he would even have the city and the temple destroyed. He didn't do that lightly. They begged for it, and they received it. Now the Lord, before that happened, says, in that day, verse 31, he which is upon the housetop and his stuff in the house, let him not come down to take it away. He that is in the field, let him likewise not turn back. Remember Lot's wife. It's in the context of turning back. Why would she be turning back? Why would she be looking longingly? Because she was a product of Sodom. I said a while ago, I'm reading between the lines, I'll admit here. But one of the reasons why Lot perhaps spent such a long time in Sodom and did not leave, as I can imagine Lot, if he ever thought about such, his wife saying, what do you mean leave? Our kids are happy here. Our life is here. That was her town. It was his town by foolish choice, and it became his family's town. The next part of the story, Lot the broken, this is really all a part of the same thing. At the end, we find in verse 30, the last picture we have of Lot involves him now leaving Zoar and going to the mountains because he was afraid. Afraid that God was going to destroy Zoar, afraid of the people because they saw him as some sort of a jinx. I don't know why, but he went to the mountains that he didn't want to go to at first. Isolated. Think about Lot. Lot with all his flocks and his herds and whatever family he had, and now he's living in a cave with his 2 daughters. He's lost his wife. He's lost everything. And the daughters come up with a plan that is straight from the depths of the devil. The firstborn said to the younger, our father is old, and there's not a man of the earth to come in to us after the manner of all the earth. Let's just get our father to drink wine, and we will lie with him and preserve seed of our father. And so she did, and the next night, after it worked one time, they pulled that same stunt again with the other daughter. They made their fathers to, verse 35, drink wine that night also, and the younger rose and lay with him. And he perceived not when she lay down nor when she arose. Again, if we take the Holy Spirit to be talking about Lot as a righteous man, I don't believe Lot knowingly, understanding what he was doing, would ever have committed incest. But he did. It was the cleverness of his daughters on this occasion that brought about that circumstance. Where in the world would 2 young women ever get such an idea? Come up with such a devilish plan? Well, they grew up in Sodom. They grew up in Sodom. And that's, I think, an important point for me to take away from this. Here's a righteous man. We asked the question earlier, how many members of Lot's family did he lose in that mess with Sodom? He lost them all. He lost his wife. He lost whoever was in the city that was destroyed. He lost these 2 that came out of the city. They were gone. They were gone. What's the problem? Well, the problem was that Lot pitched his tent toward Sodom. And in part, that's true. But I tell you, I had a fellow ask the question one time, and I hadn't thought about it this way. Maybe you can help me with this. What do you suppose the difference is in moving your family toward Sodom and moving your family toward Los Angeles or New York City or Chicago or Atlanta, or fill in the blank? There might be some differences. But those places are the production center of evils that maybe we wouldn't even be familiar with. We wouldn't even know about, heard about. And the point is that Lot's decision to go toward Sodom and to stay there worked a disaster. But the ultimate disaster came not because these people were in Sodom, but because Sodom was in them. So why did Lot lose his whole family? He lost his whole family because they became influenced by, immersed in, and swallowed by the world. That's the danger that we have. Romans 12 and verse 2 we've all thought about many times. Do not be conformed to this world, but ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. Or as this translation says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. I like one translation that says, don't be shaped by this world. Lot lost his family because his family, he never did become shaped by the world. But Lot's family became shaped by this world. How does that happen? How does it happen to us? You ever known good people who lost their children? They didn't teach their children to do evil. I'm sure that Lot never taught his daughters to do the things that they did or think as they did. But that's the point. Lot was not the dominant force in shaping his children's life. And because of that, he lost them. I think about the influences on our children. If we want to avoid the disaster of Lot's family, what we have to do is we have to guard our children against evil influences. Bad company corrupts good character. I realize that the context here really is about false teachers. But I think that principle is true. A fellow told us this when our children were young. Our kids are 30 now, grown. But when our children were young, the point was stressed with us that one of the key ways to guard your children, you better know every person they associate with from a young age. You need to know them. You need to know their parents. You know where they are, what they're doing. Evil influences of those that they go to school with. And sometimes it's not just the students. It can be the teachers and the teaching environment. I know some wonderful teachers in public schools. But the truth is, from elementary school through university, there are things that are going to be taught by figures in authority that will drag your children down, that will twist their thinking, that will make that which is sinful seem okay and that which is holy seem to be profane. Lot lost his children because he was not the dominant force in their thinking. He wasn't guarding their thinking. And by the way, let me just say this, and we don't have time to develop this point. But when you look over in look over in the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, verse 1. I recognize this to be true too, and I don't know that we've given enough time really to stress this point. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. There's an obligation that children have ultimately to make decisions and right decisions. And I'm not trying to take away the responsibility that young people have to make good decisions. The truth is, with the best of parents, they can't guard you every second. We had a young man that was with us there in Alabama. There was a broken home situation. The dad was trying to do the best he could. He was a drug addict. Handsome kid, you know, con artist, look you in the eye and convince you of anything. But to get him straight, they decided he needed just to leave the house, and there was a good family up in Indiana that took him in. They lived out in the middle of a cornfield in Indiana. Did you know you can find drugs if you don't have a car and you live in the middle of a cornfield in Indiana? You can find drugs if you're looking for them. You can find a way to do wrong, or you can find a way to do right. So I'm not eliminating the responsibility of young people as they grow up to make their own decisions, right decisions. But what I'm talking about is laying a foundation to where children know what's right and care about what's right. And somehow that was lost. There was a disconnect between Lot, who cared deeply, and his family, who didn't seem to care at all. Influences of the people we associate with, school systems, things of that nature. But let me tell you, folks that we don't even see eye to eye can influence greatly. Netflix, 6,000 shows on Netflix. Try to find 2 that are not either evil propaganda or just pure pornography. Maybe you can. Maybe you can find 3. But the point I think all of us would agree on is that there's just a lot of trash out there streaming through. And sometimes, and I think better of you than this, but there are times when there is just, it seems, little or no parental control over that matter. What people listen to. YouTube. YouTube is a tool that we've used down there at North Bibb to try to preach and teach on. We reach a very small audience, but we reach some people. It can be used for good, but you might reach 20 or 50 or 100 people, but they're influencers that have, I forget the term, is it subscribers or followers or whatever, 1 million, 1.5 million, 10 million views. And just sometime as a parent, just go and check on some of these influencers. And what you find is these folks, the language they use is corrupt. The values are immoral. The messages that are preached there are materialism, sexual license, corruption. I had an old professor of mine who used to say, back in the days when television was the dominant thing, before the internet, he used to say, you know the worst thing that television does to our society? He said all of the pornography and the sexual innuendo, all that's terrible. But he said he thought the worst thing that television did to our society is it taught people a false set of values, that you're not really living unless you're young and rich and good looking. And as he used to say, I ain't none of those things. And never have been but one, and I was young. But when you preach to people a message, a false view of life, nobody goes to church on the internet. None of these influencers ever mention God. If they do, it's in a reverent way. When you watch television, you don't see religion portrayed in a good light. When this becomes that which influences our children and teaches our children, those messages land and they stick. And if we're not careful, it can undermine the things we think we're teaching and we're saying. Music has a powerful influence. God has a place for music, but the world's music is corrupt and rotten, and it's misleading in every way. So a lot more could be said about that. But the danger of a righteous man losing his family because Sodom was teaching them and influencing them more than he realized, I think. Let me mention passages like, keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. How can we do that? And how can we not do that in reference to raising up our children? Teaching them, guarding their heart. I'll set no wicked thing before my eyes. I had a friend of mine that had this taped to the top of his television back again in the day, or maybe put on the top of your computer screen or your phone. I'll set no wicked thing before mine eyes. I hate the work of them that turn aside. It shall not cleave to me. Thy word have I hid in mine heart, that I might not sin against thee. Or in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8, finally, brothers, whatever is true and honorable and just and lovely and commendable, think on that. Meditate upon that. You know, guarding our children's thinking is a critically important job, and I trust all of us are involved with that every day. We need to know, when you hand your kid a phone and just say, have at it, that's insane to do that, with all respect. To put the guards on them, to check on them. Well, I don't want to make my kids feel like I don't trust them. They need the security of knowing that they're being watched over. And I think we'll not be sorry about that later. Let me look at quickly in the last few minutes of the lesson another example that deserves a lot more attention. In 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, according to the promise of life in Christ Jesus, to Timothy, dearly beloved son, grace, mercy, and peace from God the Father and Christ Jesus our Lord. I thank God whom I serve from my forefathers with a pure conscience, that without ceasing I have remembrance of thee in my prayers night and day, greatly desiring to see thee, being mindful of thy tears, that I might be filled with joy when I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith that is in thee, that dwelt first in thy grandmother Lois and thy mother Eunice, and I am persuaded in thee also. Eunice's household, very different story. Eunice's household was a story of success. It produced Timothy. What a great man he was. What a devoted servant he was. Paul called him a man of God, a fighter in the good fight of faith, a brother and God's co-worker. If we had time, we could just go through the map and we could just look. Timothy was from Lystra in this area here. And Acts tells us that Lystra and Iconium, those brethren thought well of him. We find him on the second journey making his way over to Europe. And we read about Timothy working alongside Paul in Philippi, in Thessalonica, in Berea. We find that when Paul winds up at on the third journey, likewise, Timothy accompanies him. We find him at Rome here when the book of Acts ends. And Paul writes from Rome, the book of Philippians, and he says, I hope to send Timothy to you, and he compliments him in these terms that I'm sure you remember. He said, I don't have anybody like-minded who will naturally care for your state. Everybody thinks about their own. But he said, this man naturally cares for your state. You know that as a father, a son with a father, he has served with me in the gospel. He's one of the great men of the Scriptures. He wasn't Paul's son literally, but he was somebody's son. And I'm sure he brought a great deal of pleasure and pride to his mother, Eunice, and his grandmother, Lois. Let me go back. What made Timothy great? What made him great? It was not the strong moral climate of his society that he grew up in. You go over to Romans chapter 1, and I'll tell you what you notice when you read that laundry list of the sins of the Gentiles. You read of a society that sounds an awful lot like ours. We tend to think that somehow our society is just worse than any that's ever been. That's not true. He talks about a society filled with all unrighteousness, Romans 1:29, fornication, wickedness, covetousness. I find people today that have not a clue about sexual morals. They don't have any idea there's anything wrong with fornication or even adultery. Well, that was not that much different than it was when the gospel was first planted. Quit making excuses, Wesley. Don't think the world is so terrible now the gospel won't work. It worked in the first century. It wasn't the wholesome world he grew up in. It wasn't even the peaceful religious situation. I don't know a lot about the church at Lystra. I know what you know from reading Acts. I do know that it was in, at least in some maps, that region of Galatia. And when Paul wrote to the Galatians, it's one of the hottest letters of the New Testament, isn't it? I mean, it's one of the most blunt and edgy letters. He starts off by saying, I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that called you to the grace of Christ to another gospel. Not another, but one would pervert the gospel of Christ. He said, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth? It's a very plain, blunt letter in which Paul calls them down. For what? There was a false teaching that had taken root in that region, that you had to become a Jew to become a Christian. It was false. It was a dishonor to the cross of Christ and to the all-sufficiency of the gospel. My point is that that's the area Timothy grew up in. Sometimes, again, I might have this a false idea that there was a time when there was no religious division. There was a time when everything was peaceful. Everybody understood the truth the same way. That's never been so. When the apostles were on the earth, there were false teachers that were active, and Timothy grew up in that environment. It wasn't because he had such a strong spiritual father. In fact, in Acts 16, you remember there, the point is made that twice that his father was a Greek. That's about all we know about him. But he certainly was not a spiritual influence. I don't even know if he was a believer in Jehovah. So how does a guy growing up in an evil world with church division rampant and no father to be there as a spiritual guide to him, how does he come through all of this? Well, he had the advantage of having a spiritual mother and a grandmother who brought him up in sincere faith. The word faith is used in several ways in the Scriptures, and we'll just mention these. But I think they're extremely important. In the first place, faith can be taken in terms of the faith. Timothy was a man of the faith. He had been brought up in that. The secret things belong to God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children. Timothy, from a young age, was brought up not on nonsense, but on the Scriptures. You have learned, you have heard, you have read, you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make thee wise to salvation. It makes all the difference. The Scriptures being taught to a young person. Let me look at Psalm 119. In Psalm 119, the psalmist, in that great psalm about the Word of God, asked the question in verse 9, wherewithal shall a young man cleanse his way? By taking heed thereunto according to thy word. With my whole heart have I sought thee. O let me not wander from thy commandments. He said, thy word have I hid in my heart, that I might not sin against thee. If you're trying to raise a Timothy, raise them in the faith. In the second place, I think Timothy was a young man who must have been raised in the faith in the sense of having a trust in God. Word belief and faith used interchangeably in the Scriptures. But I think we use the terms differently sometimes. But faith is a strong word. It's a word that suggests a real, genuine trust. It's interesting to me that when the Lord in that great Sermon on the Mount was talking to us about basic fundamental principles of the kingdom, one of the things that he chose to emphasize was this, that you have to learn how to trust God in life, to put Him first and trust Him for the rest. I don't believe Timothy grew up in a home where he heard his mother doubting God and worried about the next day. Be anxious for nothing. You want to raise a Timothy? Show faith in the way you deal with life, in the way you deal with your circumstances, in the way you deal with the future. The negative talk and the faithless talk has an impact on young minds. Show faith in God. And finally, I believe there's faith in the sense of faithfulness, in the sense of a consistency. I doubt very much that Timothy would have grown up with a mother who would have had to decide every week, are we going to church this week or not? Well, they knew what they were going to do, because their pattern, their course was laid. We're going to serve God. We're going to put Him first. And whatever God asks us to do, I love that expression in Romans 2 and verse 7. To those who by faithful continuance in well-doing. Let your home be one in which there is a faithful continuance in well-doing. You have two homes that in some ways were similar. I don't think that Lot's wife was much of a help. She's not mentioned as being a righteous woman while he's a righteous man. And here is Timothy's mother, Eunice. And she doesn't seem to have that companion that helps her to raise spiritually. And yet, one was successful and one wasn't. The simple difference between them was one allowed, maybe unknowingly, their children to be absorbed by the evil around them, and the other raised their children with a determined purpose of raising them in faith in every sense of that word. I'm not talking about these things today to open old wounds or to make us feel badly about mistakes we've made in the past. Let me tell you something I've learned as a parent. You're going to make mistakes. I made plenty of them. And if the mistakes I made weren't fatal, that might be just the grace of God. But I'm really more aiming this lesson toward those who are younger here and those who may one day have children. And I'm saying to you, understand that just being a good person is no guarantee of success. See Lot. But that if we are determined day by day by day to serve God and to raise our children to love Him, then we'll be able, I believe, by God's help, to be successful. I hope that that's of some help to you. So we'll pause now. Thank you for your kind attention.